This video is for Chemistry in the Earth System, Unit 3.1, Ion Formation. Today's essential question: how do cations and anions differ? Our first main idea: cations and anions. An early model of the atom was developed in 1913 by the Danish scientist Niels Bohr. This model shows the atom as a central nucleus containing protons and neutrons, with the electrons in a circular set of electron shells orbiting at specific distances from the nucleus, much like planets orbiting a star. Each electron shell has a different energy level, and those shells closest to the nucleus have a lower energy than those farther from the nucleus. The outermost shell is called the valence shell, and electrons present in this shell are called valence electrons. Positively charged ions are called cations. A cation forms when an atom loses one or more valence electrons. Again, loses one or more valence electrons. Cations usually form from the atoms of metals, such as sodium, potassium, calcium, copper, and iron. Negatively charged ions are called anions. An anion forms when an atom gains one or more electrons in its valence shell. Anions usually form from the atoms of nonmetals. Again, nonmetals such as fluorine, chlorine, oxygen, and sulfur, among others. A useful mnemonic to recall the difference is that cats have paws. Cations are positive. Our next main idea: predicting the charge of a cation or anion. The charge on a cation or anion can be predicted from the number of valence electrons in an atom. The number of valence electrons can be determined by noting the group in which the atom's elements appears in the periodic table. Groups toward the left of the periodic table tend to lose electrons and therefore become cations. With the exception of group 18, the noble gases, groups toward the right of the periodic table tend to gain electrons and therefore form anions. For example, the atoms of group 1 elements, lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium, and francium, have only one valence electron. These atoms readily lose their valence electrons. Loss of an electron from an atom of any of these elements will thus create a cation with a charge of +1. Group 2 elements, like beryllium, magnesium, calcium, strontium, barium, and radium, have 2 valence electrons that they tend to lose. In these elements, losing those 2 valence electrons from their atoms produces cations. Again, they've lost electrons, so these are cations with a charge of 2+. The charge on an anion is predicted in the same way. For example, the atoms of group 17 elements, like fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine, and astatine, all have 7 valence electrons. So these atoms tend to gain a single electron. This gain results in the ions of these elements having a charge of -1. The atoms of group 16 elements, like oxygen, sulfur, selenium, and tellurium, have 6 valence electrons. These atoms tend to gain 2 electrons, so The atoms of these elements tend to have a charge of -2. At this point, you should be able to generate a full and complete answer to today's essential question: how do cations and anions differ?